Today, I want to talk about one of my all-time grail pens, and that is the Montblanc 149 with the calligraphy flexible nib. So I've owned this pen for about a year, and I've held off making a video about it because there's a lot of content out there about this pen, and I wanted to think through, how do I view this pen? Does it work as a daily writer? What is this all about? Because this pen, even though I really do like this pen, it is not quite what I expected when I bought it. Um, but a bit of the history, I've wanted this pen since it was announced a few years ago, because I thought the idea of having 149, which is a really nice, comfortable size for me, um, with a very unique nib, was just very appealing. But I kind of hemmed and hawed about buying it and put it off because it's an expensive pen, and I missed out on the first batch, and then there was a special edition from a retailer in Germany. It was a flexi stub model that I debated on and missed out on that as well. And then this came in stock again, and I think by that point my wife was tired of me talking about the pen, and she bought it for me as a gift to commemorate a career milestone I had last year. So that's how I came to own it. I promised myself that if I were to own this pen, I would make sure I actually use it. So I've had this pen inked ever since I bought it, and I've used it quite a bit. But the reason why I wanted to make this video is to tell you about how this pen actually performs, because this is not what I expected. Like I said, it's not what I expected when I bought it. So in order to explain that, I wanted to talk about different ways that you can get a calligraphy type writing experience. And in my mind, there are three ways. The first way is I like to demonstrate with this Platinum 3776 with the coarse nib. So the first way is to have a very broad nib. Because as you can see, when you have a nib that's very broad, it makes quite an impact on the page. But the other cool thing is when you have a nice broad nib, you can get a lot of shading in the ink, which is nice. The problem with the broad nib is that it doesn't give you any line variation. So this has approximately the same horizontal stroke as a vertical stroke. So this is really good for having a very expressive writing style, but it doesn't offer any line variation. It just offers shading. The second way to do this is with some sort of shaped nib. So either an architect grind, a stub, some sort of italic nib. This is a very inexpensive pen. This is a Pilot Kakuno with a Pilot stub nib. And this will offer line variation. And this is a very effortless way to have a very cool flair style to the writing. Because the nib is shaped, it's not just a rounded tipping material, you can have line variation with no effort. You just write normally and you get a very nice line. When you typically use a steel nib that's either a stub or italic, you'll find that there's very little tipping material. I don't know if my camera will focus on this, but these steel nibs are pretty much just metal. The problem with that is that you don't get the wetness of a nib where you have very generous tipping, so you don't really get a lot of the shading that you would get from um, a gold nib or like the platinum nib here. You can fix that problem by using a nicer version of a stub nib. So this is a Sailor Music nib, which is essentially just a stub nib, and hopefully you can tell this nib, if it focuses. Will it focus? Okay, so if you take my word for it, this nib has a generous, there you go, a generous amount of tipping material on the top. So this is, if you use something like this, you can see that you can get both line variation and shading very effortlessly from a stub nib. So why am I giving that context? It's because when you talk about the third way I think you can have expressive writing from a nib, you can get this from a flex nib. But while a flex nib can offer you both line variation and shading, so this nib, for example, the problem is it's not an effortless way to write. This requires more awareness, and it requires putting pressure on the nib to make it flex, which is not something that you have to do with the other types of nibs. So this is something that took me a while to get used to. I told you that this pen was not what I expected. The behavior of the flex was pretty much what I had in mind. You have to push to get flex. What I didn't realize is how fine this nib is. I always thought this pen would write more boldly, would write with a broader line when you don't put pressure on it. But this is really, like, if you see, I'm not putting pressure here. And this is really a Western extra fine. Which means if you use this pen on a daily basis and you're not putting pressure and writing, this doesn't really give you much of anything. It doesn't give you much line variation, doesn't give you much shading. It just writes like an extra fine. So that's something that I think is important to know going into this. If you're expecting a nib that will write effortlessly like a stub nib, like if you're thinking about a nib that you think is going to write like this without any effort, this Montblanc is not that. What it does do though is it offers a very nice feedback when you write. So when you write normally, it offers a nice bounce to the writing, which reminds me a lot of pens like the Pilot Falcon. Not the FA nib, just the regular Falcon nib. The FA nib is much softer than this, but pens like the Metal Falcon, the regular Falcon, the Metal Falcon, it has that nice bounce to it, and you can write very comfortably on a day-to-day basis and not really leverage the flex. However, if you do flex the nib, you can get a nice amount of line variation, but just know that this takes a lot more effort than if you were just to use a stub nib or something like that. So what are my thoughts on this pen? Well, I know that you can get much cheaper flex nibs. There are steel nib flex nibs like the Omni flex nib. You can get vintage flex nibs. that are a fraction of this price. In my experience, these steel nibs don't work very well. Like if you've tried something like a Noodler's flex nib, or I think Yovo makes a number 6 sized flex nib, those honestly they don't work very well. You can get a vintage flex nib for much less than this pen, but those tend to write, in my experience, more like what you would get from a Pilot FA nib, which is much softer and, in the way I write, much more difficult to use on a day-to-day basis. So if you're looking for a flex nib and you like the ability to use the pen on a day-to-day basis, then this is a really nice choice. And to me, this is not a pen I use daily. I have it inked up, but I don't use this pen daily because this is not really the style of writing I usually do. But if you're looking for that flex nib, you're okay with the fact that it comes out of the box very fine, and you prefer a flex nib over like a stub nib or just a broader nib, then there really is no better option that I've tried in the market than this. So I think this pen is a very hyped pen, and in my opinion, it deserves the hype. That said, for me personally, I much prefer a stub nib to write when I want some more character in my writing. And the reason is I just don't like to, naturally I don't write with a lot of pressure when I write. And the stub nibs, even something like this $12 Pilot Kakuno, can give you a lot of line variation and character in your writing without much effort at all. So to me, from a day-to-day writing perspective, for something that's easy to use, I tend to grab stub nibs much more often than I do this 149. However, again, if you're looking for a flex nib, this really is the one to buy. It's a grail pen for me, and it doesn't disappoint. So hope that was fun. Hope that was a useful overview of what this pen is like to use on a day-to-day basis, and hope that gives you an idea of why the way it performs, the way it writes, is not what I really expected when I bought the pen, but something that I am quite happy with. So thank you for watching, and have a great weekend.